Lesson 14. Joseph delivers his brethren. These things happened unto them for examples. Reading Genesis 42 to 47. Objective: to see how God works to save his people, to examine the example of Joseph in forgiveness of his brothers, and consider how the events in Joseph's life foreshadowed the life of Christ. Background: Joseph had faithfully endured under trial in Egypt, and God rewarded that faithfulness as he brought Joseph into a position of authority in Egypt. Joseph's trust in God had saved the nation of Egypt from 7 years of severe famine. Famine in Canaan brings Joseph's brothers to Egypt. Genesis 42 verses 1 to 5. The land of Canaan was also affected by the famine, which was over Egypt. After less than 2 years, the desperate situation caused Jacob to send Joseph's 10 brethren down to Egypt, that they might buy corn and live. However, he kept Benjamin with him in Canaan, because he feared that trouble might befall him as it had Joseph. Joseph's brothers come before the governor. Genesis 42 verses 6 to 17. Joseph was the governor of the land of Egypt, and his brothers came and bowed themselves to him with their faces to the earth. Joseph resisted any desire to tell them who he was, but rather set about to test them to see if they had changed their attitude since he last saw them. It had now been 22 years since they spitefully threw him into the pit and sold him into Egypt. He spoke roughly to them and accused them of being spies. He interrogated them and put them in prison 3 days. Joseph tests his brethren. Genesis 42 verses 18 to 38. In order to prove their innocence before Joseph, they told him of their family circumstances in Canaan, of their father and of their younger brother still at home. Joseph demanded that they prove their claims. One of them would remain bound in Egypt as a captive, while the others returned home, and then they would need to bring their youngest brother down to Egypt. Their response to this request was remarkable. In front of Joseph, they began to express to each other their guilt over the way they treated Joseph years before. They spoke of his anguish and how they did not respond to his distress. They saw their situation as being justice for the way they had cruelly treated him. Joseph was so overcome with emotion at their confession that he had to turn away from them and weep. They left Simeon behind and returned to the land of Canaan. On their way home, one of them found money in his sack, greatly increasing their fear about the things which had happened to them. When they reached Jacob, they told him what had happened. To make things worse, they all found their money in their sacks. They were afraid all the more. Joseph's brothers' second return to Egypt. Genesis 43 verse 1 to 25. It was obvious that they needed to go again to Egypt and to buy more corn. Reuben tried to persuade his father to put Benjamin in his care when they returned to Egypt, and foolishly offered the lives of his own sons if anything should happen to Benjamin. Jacob refused and said, "My son shall not go down with you." Genesis 42 verse 36 to 38. However, the desperate situation of the famine brought them to the point where they had eaten all the corn, and they had to go down to Egypt again. It was now Judah's turn to try and convince their father. He repeated the demands of the ruler of Egypt that they bring their brother with them, and convinced his father of their desperate need. Unlike Reuben, he did not offer his sons' lives if he did not bring Benjamin back. he offered to personally bear the blame. Genesis 43 verse 9. So Joseph's brothers appeared before him again with Benjamin. Joseph arranged a feast that they might eat together in his house that day. This caused his brothers more fear, as they imagined how the ruler of Egypt was conspiring to have them taken as slaves. They spoke privately to the steward of Joseph's house about the events which had befallen them, of the money in their sacks, and the additional money they had brought with them this time. They sought his help, that perhaps he could convince his master that they were genuine and honest men. Verse 19 to 22. To this the steward replied, Peace be to you, fear not. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. Verse 23. Interestingly, his reply reveals that he knew their situation, of their family and of their beliefs. He reunited them with Simeon and made them comfortable while he attended to their asses and waited for Joseph. Joseph dines with his brethren. Genesis 43 verse 26 to 34. When Joseph came home, the emotion of the occasion was hard for him to control. He asked after the welfare of his father and then turned his attention to his younger brother Benjamin and said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. Such was the overwhelming emotion that he had to restrain himself and rush from the room to his private chamber to weep. Verse 29 to 30. After he had washed himself and returned, he asked that the meal be served. He kept his identity from his brothers, eating separately from them, yet giving them great honor. To Benjamin in particular, he gave 5 times the helping of his brothers. Joseph tests his brethren the second time. Genesis 44 verse 1 to 13. Joseph had not yet revealed himself to his brothers because he still had one more test to prove their genuine repentance for their past evil ways. The time had come for them to return home. Joseph commanded his servant that not only should their money be returned to their sacks, but that Joseph's own silver cup was to be put in the sack of Benjamin. As the men made their journey, he sent his servant after them to question them about the cup and to ask, Wherefore have ye rewarded evil for good? Verse 4. The brothers, surprised and confident of their honesty, offered that if the cup were found, the person with whom it was found would die, and the brothers would become servants of the ruler. The servants said that the one with whom it was found would become servant, and the others would be blameless. Beginning at the eldest and finishing at Benjamin, the servants searched their goods, and sure enough, the cup was found with Benjamin. The brothers rent their clothes and returned to the city. Unlike the time when they deserted Joseph and took no concern for their father's feeling, they now made every effort to secure the safe return of Benjamin to his father. Judah's plea for his brothers. Genesis 44 verse 14 to 34. Once more they found themselves in Joseph's presence, and once more bowed themselves before him. Joseph accused them of stealing the cup. There was no justification possible, and Judah responded by saying, God had found out the iniquity of thy servants, and that they would all become his servants. Verse 16. Once more, Joseph gave them the opportunity to abandon their brother by saying that they should go in peace to their father, but only the man with whom the cup was found would be his servant. With fear in their hearts, and having the love of their father and their conscience toward God tested in such a remarkable way, Judah was caused to recount to Joseph the whole story. He poured out his heart to Joseph and said that if they came to their father without Benjamin, Jacob would die of grief. He pleaded with Joseph to let him be the servant instead of Benjamin. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Genesis 45 verses 1 to 8. With Judah's heartfelt plea, Joseph could refrain himself no further, and sent everyone except his brothers from the room so that he could reveal himself to them. So loud was his weeping that the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. I am Joseph your brother, verse 3. His brothers could not bring themselves to answer because of the fear they now felt being in his presence, and because they imagined that he would have revenge on them. So Joseph brought them near to him and told them not to be grieved or angry with themselves, but to see the hand of God at work in preserving life, for God had delivered them from the famine. He explained to them what had happened was because of divine providence. Verse 7 to 8. Principle for living. Forgiveness. Don't hold grudges. Forgiveness is one of the qualities of God. Exodus 34 verse 7. To the Lord our God belong mercies and forgivenesses, though we have rebelled against him. Daniel 9 verse 9. In Joseph's acceptance of his brothers and his desire that they should learn from the experience to love God, their father, and each other, we have a wonderful example. Joseph's forgiveness shows us the extent to which we should forgive others. This is especially so because of the extent to which God is willing to forgive our sins. He has provided us with access to the way of salvation through his Son, Ephesians 4 verse 32. And we should be followers or imitators of God as dear children, Ephesians 5 verse 1. The Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6 verse 12 asks that God forgives us as we forgive others. Our own forgiveness is on the basis of how we treat others. If we are not prepared to show mercy to others, we cannot expect God to show mercy to us. Verse 14 to 15. The Apostle James exhorts us to grudge not one against the other, brethren, lest ye be condemned. James 5 verse 9. What James is saying is that if we hold a grudge, we have not shown forgiveness, and therefore will not receive forgiveness. Not only did Joseph not seek revenge on his brothers, he sought to bring his brothers near to him, and to show his love and affection for them. He forgave them their wrong as God himself hath turned it around, and brought good out of evil in preserving their lives through the famine. Joseph sends for Jacob. Genesis 45 verse 9 to 28. Joseph sent his brothers to Jacob with the wonderful news that he was alive and that God had made him ruler over Egypt. He told them to bring his father down to Egypt and all his family, and Joseph would provide for them in the 5 years of famine which was yet to come. Joseph was highly respected in Egypt, and even Pharaoh himself provided the wagons needed to bring Jacob and all his family from the land of Canaan, where they could live in the best of the land of Egypt. So his brothers left to get their father with gifts and supplies that they would need, and he told them, see that ye fall not out by the way. Verse 24. When Jacob heard the story of Joseph, he did not believe it, until he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him. He was brought to believe, and his spirit revived. Verse 27. Jacob settles in Egypt. Genesis 46 and 47. It was God's intention that the descendants of Abraham would dwell in a land that was not theirs for 400 years. Genesis 15 verse 13. It was necessary that they move and settle in a foreign land. So Yahweh reassured Jacob in a dream, saying, I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. Genesis 46 verse 4. 22 years had passed since the devastating separation of Jacob and Joseph. Hearing the news of his father's approach, Joseph rode out to meet Jacob. Their reunion was an extremely emotional experience as father and son met again after so many years. Verse 29 to 30. They came into Egypt, where Pharaoh commanded that they share the best that Egypt could offer, and was pleased to have them settle in the land of Goshen, where they could support their herds and flocks. Genesis 47 verse 5 to 6. Joseph's life paralleled to Christ. There are very clear parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Christ. This is seen throughout Joseph's life. The following table shows just some of the similarities, which I will read one after the other. The life of Joseph, and then the life of Jesus. 1. Loved by his father. Genesis 37 verse 3. Beloved of his father. Matthew 3 verse 17. 2. Hated by his brethren. Genesis 37 verse 4. The Jews hated me without a cause. John 15 verse 25. 3. His brethren said, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? Genesis 37 verse 8. We will not have this man to reign over us. Luke 19 verse 14 and John 19 verse 15. 4. Joseph's brothers conspired against him to kill him. Genesis 37 verse 18. The Jews conspired together how they might kill Jesus. Matthew 26 verse 3 to 4. 5. His brethren mocked him. Genesis 37 verse 19. The elders mocked him. Matthew 27 verse 29 and 41 to 42. 6. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Genesis 37 verse 28. Christ was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Matthew 26 verse 15. 7. Joseph was sold into Egypt as good as dead. Genesis 37 verses 26 to 27 and verses 32 to 33. Jesus was crucified by his Jewish brethren. Matthew 27 verse 31 and Acts 2 verse 23. 8. God allowed Joseph's suffering in order to preserve life. Genesis 45 verse 7. To save men from sin and death. God's purpose was being worked out in the sufferings of Christ. Genesis 3 verse 15. Summary. Very early in his life, Joseph had learnt to trust in God, even in the most difficult situations. His faith allowed him to recognize the work of God in his life and to believe that God was with him even though he was in Egypt. Joseph's brethren had repented of their former evil ways and were humbled by their trials, seeking mercy from their brother. Joseph could see God's purpose with him and forgave his brothers for their crime against him. We must be careful not to hold grudges, but to forgive those who do us wrong.
These lessons are the words taken from the Christadelphian Sunday School Association notes, www.cssa.asn.au, used with permission. Email your questions to readthebible2@gmail.com, and we look forward to you listening to the next lesson, which will be called
Moses, Israel's Deliverer.